What if I told you one of the most famous guitar riffs in rock history came from a band that nearly destroyed itself chasing success? Four British blues musicians searching for bigger crowds and louder stages. Within a few years, they would sell millions of albums, dominate American radio, and create the anthem, Slow Ride. The road that made them famous would slowly tear them apart. Members would quit at the peak of success. Creative fights would fracture the band. And the man who led it all would refuse to stop touring, even while dying of cancer. This is the story of Foghat. The story begins in London in the early 1970s. At the time, the British blues boom was already producing giants. Bands like Cream, Fleetwood Mac, and Led Zeppelin had taken American blues and turned it into heavy rock that filled arenas. But behind those famous names were dozens of musicians grinding through clubs every night. One of those bands was Savoy Brown. Savoy Brown had respect. They toured constantly and built a loyal audience. Inside the band were three musicians who believed they could create something bigger. Dave Peverett was the singer and rhythm guitarist. Fans would later call him Lonesome Dave. His voice had a rough edge that fit heavy blues rock perfectly. On bass was Tony Stevens, a solid player who kept the music tight. Behind the drums sat Roger Earl, whose powerful playing pushed every song forward. For years, they toured relentlessly. But eventually the three musicians reached a crossroads. Savoy Brown was successful enough to survive, but not explosive enough to break through. Meanwhile, something huge was happening across the Atlantic. American FM radio was changing everything. Unlike AM radio, which played short pop singles, FM stations allowed DJs to play longer songs and deeper album tracks. Loud guitar bands suddenly had a place where their music could thrive. Dave Peverett believed their sound belonged in America. So in 1971, Peverett, Stevens, and Earl made a bold decision. All three of them quit Savoy Brown at the same time. They weren't just leaving a band, they were abandoning security to chase a bigger dream. But they still needed a lead guitarist. They found him in Rod Price. Price was a master of bottleneck slide guitar. Using a glass slide along the strings, he produced a sound that felt raw and powerful. When he played, the guitar seemed to scream. That slide guitar would soon become the band's signature. Now they needed a name. Dave Peverett remembered a nonsense word he had invented with his brother as a kid during a board game. The word was Foghat. It meant absolutely nothing, but the band loved it. It sounded playful, loud, and rebellious. Four British musicians chasing an American rock dream had just created Foghat, but their first album would barely make a dent on the charts. And strangely enough, that small beginning would open the door to something much bigger, because the rise of FM radio was about to change their lives. Foghat entered the studio in 1972 to record their first album. The record would be self-titled, simply called Foghat. The sessions were produced by Dave Edmunds, a respected musician who understood the raw blues sound the band wanted. The goal was simple: capture the energy they played with on stage. No fancy tricks, no polished pop production, just loud guitars, driving drums, and the heavy groove that came from four musicians locked into the same rhythm. When the album finally arrived in 1972, the numbers looked disappointing at first. It climbed only to around number 127 on the Billboard 200 chart. By normal industry standards, that meant the record was barely noticed. But something unusual was happening behind the scenes. The early 1970s were the birth of FM rock radio. Unlike the old AM stations, FM DJs had freedom. They could pick songs they personally loved. They could play longer tracks that didn't fit the pop formula. And when a DJ liked a band, they might spin the record several times a night. For Foghat, this was perfect. One track from the album started catching attention on these stations. It was their heavy blues cover of Willie Dixon's "I Just Want to Make Love to You." The song wasn't new. Muddy Waters had recorded it years earlier.
I just want to make love to you.
But Foghat turned it into something louder and more aggressive. Rod Price's slide guitar cut through the speakers, while Roger Earl's drums pushed the groove forward like a rolling train. FM radio loved it. Listeners began hearing the track late at night on rock stations across America. It wasn't pushed by massive marketing. It spread naturally. Someone heard it, told their friends, and suddenly the band had a growing following. And here's something important. Foghat made sure Willie Dixon received full credit and royalties for the song. That may sound obvious today, but many rock bands of that era were not always careful about crediting blues writers. Foghat understood they were building on a tradition, and they respected it. As the radio play grew, the band's label saw an opportunity, so Foghat went back to work quickly. Between 1972 and 1974, the band released 4 albums in just 3 years. The schedule was brutal. The first record was followed by another self-titled album, often nicknamed Rock and Roll. Then came Energized and Rock and Roll Outlaws. The second album finally gave them their first real commercial milestone. It went gold, meaning it sold 500,000 copies, but album sales were only part of the story. The real engine behind Foghat was touring. Night after night, they traveled across the United States playing clubs, theaters, and small arenas. The band developed a reputation for incredibly loud shows and long jams that stretched songs far beyond their studio versions. Audiences loved it. The band quickly built a loyal American fan base that kept growing with every tour. But here's where it gets interesting. The success came with a brutal schedule. Foghat often performed almost every single night of the year. Travel, sound check, show, sleep on the bus, then repeat the next day in another city. At first, the band embraced the grind. They were chasing the dream they had crossed the Atlantic to find. But what nobody realized yet was that the endless touring would eventually push one founding member past his limit. And just as Foghat was about to record the album that would change everything, the band suddenly lost one of its original members. By 1974, Foghat's machine was running at full speed. The band was on the road constantly, sometimes playing nearly every night of the year. The schedule looked exciting from the outside. Packed venues, louder crowds, and growing record sales. But the reality behind the scenes was exhausting. Endless flights, long bus rides, weeks away from home. The routine never stopped, and eventually, the strain began to show. Bassist Tony Stevens had been there from the beginning. He had left Savoy Brown to help start Foghat. He survived the early club tours and the slow climb through the American rock scene. But after years of relentless travel, Stevens reached his breaking point. In 1974, just as the band was preparing to record their next album, Stevens made a decision that shocked everyone around him. He quit. No dramatic farewell tour, no huge announcement. He simply walked away from the band he had helped create. From the outside, the timing seemed unbelievable. Foghat was finally gaining serious momentum. Their fan base was growing. FM radio was playing their music constantly. The band was closer than ever to a real breakthrough. But Stevens could not continue living on the road. The exhaustion and pressure had become too much. Foghat suddenly faced a serious problem. They were about to record their most important album yet, and their bassist was gone. But an unexpected solution appeared. Nick Jameson, who had been working closely with the band as a producer, stepped in to help. Jameson was not originally meant to become a full creative partner, but his musical instincts quickly proved valuable. He agreed to play bass during the recording sessions, and that decision would change everything. In September 1975, Foghat released the album Fool for the City. At first glance, it looked like just another rock record, but hidden inside the album was a track that would transform the band's entire career. That track was Slow Ride. The moment the song begins, listeners hear one of the most recognizable guitar intros in rock history. Rod Price's slide guitar glides into the riff, while Roger Earl locks the groove into a steady pulse. The rhythm feels relaxed and powerful at the same time, like a car cruising down an open highway. But what if I told you the magic of Slow Ride almost didn't happen? The song was written by Dave Peverett, but Nick Jameson played a crucial role in shaping the final arrangement. Together with Roger Earl, they worked out the pacing of the intro and the groove that made the song feel so hypnotic. The result was perfect. When Slow Ride reached radio stations in 1970 quickly across the same FM networks that had supported the band from the beginning, listeners immediately recognized the riff. The song felt effortless and unforgettable. Soon, it climbed the Billboard Hot 100 chart, eventually reaching number 20. For Foghat, this was the moment everything changed. The band that had once struggled to break into American radio suddenly had one of the biggest rock songs in the country. But it gets crazier. While the single was climbing the charts, the album Fool for the City was quietly selling huge numbers. It eventually reached platinum status, meaning it sold more than 1 million copies. Foghat had finally arrived as arena rock stars, but the success of Slow Ride would also bring new pressure, bigger expectations, and an even heavier touring schedule. And the next chapter of their story would prove just how powerful Foghat could be on stage. By the time Slow Ride finished climbing the charts, Foghat had become one of the most powerful touring bands in America. The song was everywhere. FM stations blasted it daily. Drivers turned it up on long highway trips. Teenagers played it on basement stereos with the volume knob pushed as far as it would go. But the band believed something important. Their music was even better live. On stage, the songs stretched out. The guitars roared louder. The groove grew deeper as the band locked into extended jams that could last twice as long as the studio versions. So Foghat decided to capture that energy on record. In August 1977, they released Foghat Live. The album was recorded mostly at the Dome Arena in Henrietta, New York. Instead of carefully polished studio takes, the record captured the band exactly as fans heard them in concert. Raw, loud, unfiltered. And here's where it gets wild. Foghat Live became the band's biggest success. The album quickly went double platinum, meaning it sold more than 2 million copies. That made it far bigger than their previous studio albums. The star of the record was an extended 8-minute version of Slow Ride. The live performance stretched the groove into a hypnotic rhythm that built slowly before exploding into roaring guitar lines from Rod Price. Fans loved it. The live version proved something Foghat had always believed. Their true power wasn't just in recording studios. It was in the connection between the band and the audience. By the late 1970s, Foghat was playing massive arenas across the United States. Their schedule was relentless. In some years, they performed close to 365 days. That level of success looked incredible from the outside. But the reality was harder. Drummer Roger Earl would later talk openly about the personal cost of those years. The band was almost never home. Months passed without seeing their families. At one point, Earl returned home after a long tour and watched something that stunned him. His young children looked at him and asked their mother who the strange man in the house was. They didn't recognize their own father. That moment revealed the hidden price of life on the road. While Foghat celebrated platinum records and sold-out arenas, their personal lives were quietly falling apart. Birthdays were missed, school events were skipped, relationships grew distant, and the pressure inside the band was growing too. In 1978, Foghat released their next studio album, Stone Blue. The record still carried their classic boogie sound and managed to reach number 35 on the Billboard 200. The title track, Stone Blue, became another fan favorite on rock radio. But behind the scenes, recording the album had been difficult. The band later admitted the sessions were tense and exhausting. Years of non-stop touring were starting to drain their energy and patience. Yet an even bigger problem was approaching. The entire music industry was beginning to change. By the end of the decade, disco was dominating dance floors. A new wave of bands with synthesizers and slick production was rising fast. Record labels were chasing new trends, and many classic rock bands suddenly felt pressure to adapt. Foghat now faced a dangerous question. Should they stay loyal to the gritty boogie sound that made them famous? Or should they chase the new styles that were taking over the charts? The answer they chose would push the band toward one of the biggest turning points in their history, and it would soon cost them the guitarist who helped create their signature sound. By the end of the 1970s, the music world no longer looked the same. Only a few years earlier, loud guitar bands ruled rock radio. Arena tours were massive, and blues-driven rock groups like Foghat seemed unstoppable. But the industry had shifted almost overnight. Disco exploded across dance floors. Songs built around smooth rhythms and polished production dominated the charts. At the same time, a new generation of bands arrived with a different look and sound. New wave groups used synthesizers, sharper guitars, and shorter songs designed for radio. Record labels watched these changes carefully, and they began asking their artists uncomfortable questions. Could they adapt? Foghat now faced that pressure. Their previous albums had been built around heavy blues grooves and long guitar jams. That sound had made them stars. But suddenly, the label wanted something more modern. In 1979, Foghat released Boogie Motel. The album stayed close to their classic style and managed to reach number 35 on the Billboard 200 chart. Songs like Third Time Lucky, First Time I Was a Fool still carried the familiar groove fans expected. But sales were beginning to slow. The label wanted a hit single that could compete with the changing sound of radio. Executives believed Foghat needed to update their music to survive in the new market, so the band tried something different. In 1980, they released the album Tight Shoes. This record leaned toward a cleaner, more pop-influenced sound. The production felt smoother, and some songs carried a slight new wave influence that was very different from the gritty, blues style the band had built its reputation on. The change confused fans. The album struggled to connect with their core audience. It eventually peaked around number 106 on the Billboard 200, a major drop compared with their earlier successes. The single, Stranger in My Hometown, barely made an impact, reaching only the lower part of the charts. But the real damage happened inside the band. Rod Price had been Foghat's sonic identity from the beginning. His slide guitar defined their sound on stage and on record. Without it, the band would never feel the same. Price was already unhappy with the constant touring schedule that had dominated their lives for years. But the new musical direction pushed him past his limit. He believed Foghat was abandoning the very sound that made them special. And here's where everything changed. In November 1980, Rod Price quit the band. He walked away rather than continue recording music that didn't feel true to him. The guitarist, whose slide riffs had powered Slow Ride and every classic Foghat track, was suddenly gone. For many fans, that moment marked the end of the classic Foghat sound. The band tried to continue. In 1981, they released Girls to Chat and Boys to Bounce. But the album only reached number 92 on the charts. 2 years later came Zigzag Walk in 1983. That record barely appeared on the charts at all. The numbers told a harsh story. Trying to follow trends had not saved Foghat. It had pushed them further away from the audience that loved them. Then another major change arrived. By 1984, even Lonesome Dave Peverett had stepped away from the band. The original lineup that once dominated arenas was gone. What remained was only a name, a legacy, and one founding member who refused to let the music disappear. Even after the classic lineup collapsed, the story of Foghat wasn't finished. Drummer Roger Earl refused to let the band disappear. While other members moved on, Earl kept the name alive through different versions of Foghat during the late 1980s. The audiences were smaller, and the glory days of double platinum albums were gone. But the music kept playing. Then something unexpected happened. In 1993, a new generation suddenly discovered Slow Ride. The song appeared in the film Dazed and Confused, a movie that celebrated the spirit of 1970s rock culture. Teenagers who had never heard of Foghat were suddenly blasting the song from their car stereos, just like their parents once had. The moment created something powerful. Interest in the band surged again. Around the same time, famous producer Rick Rubin and others began encouraging the original members to reconnect. After years apart, the classic lineup of Dave Peverett, Roger Earl, Rod Price, and Tony Stevens finally reunited. In 1994, they released the album Return of the Boogeymen. For longtime fans, it felt like a miracle. The same musicians who had once filled arenas were playing together again. The groove was back. The slide guitar was back. The brotherhood seemed restored. But time had already taken its toll. Not long after the reunion, Lonesome Dave Peverett was diagnosed with cancer. Most musicians would have stepped away from touring, but Peverett refused. He continued performing while undergoing chemotherapy and radiation treatments. Night after night, he walked onto the stage, determined to keep the music alive. On February 7, 2000, Dave Peverett died from kidney cancer, but he kept the promise he had repeated for years. "I'm going to roll till I'm old. I'm going to rock till I drop." Today, Roger Earl still carries the Foghat name forward, and decades later, the opening riff of Slow Ride still echoes across classic rock radio. reminding listeners of a band that chased the boogie all the way to the end.